Good evening, everyone. This is Shane Gebauer. I'm the general manager of BrushyMtnBeeFarm. I'd like to thank all of you for attending this evening. We've got an all-star cast lined up this evening to help us out with overwintering bees, as well as a discussion panel. I'll take just a few minutes here to introduce them before we get started, and then also as we transition from one speaker to the next, I'll give another quick introduction just so you all know who's presenting at that particular time. First up, we've got Michael Palmer out of the very, very northern reaches of Vermont. I think, Mike, you could almost fit across the Canadian border from where you are up there. It's pretty right close to that border, isn't it?
Yeah, I thought maybe I'd run for governor because I can see the border of Canada.
I'm not going to touch that one. But I'd like to thank you for being here. Mike is a commercial beekeeper with several hundred hives up, like I said, in the northern reaches of Vermont. Each spring he sells off nukes and also does some queen rearing. He's got quite a bit of experience underneath his belt and certainly can bring that northern perspective that many of you listening in this evening can appreciate, those extended periods of bitter cold weather in wintertime. And then once Mike has finished up with his portion of the presentation, we move to the other extreme. We've got Harry Fulton down in Mississippi. He's the former state apiarist down there. He's since retired. He'll talk with us regarding overwintering bees in the southern portion of the U.S., those warmer climates. Quite the opposite of what Mike is having to deal with in Vermont. And then following him, we'll move to Kim Flottum, who is in Ohio, and he'll help fill in some of the gaps that exist in sort of the mid-range of the U.S., as well as some other factors to consider when dealing with overwintering. And of course, Kim Flottum, he's the editor of Bee Culture magazine and a frequent contributor to our webinar series. So I'd like to welcome and thank all three of our speakers this evening for their time and participation in this. The way we're going to work this evening is, as I said, each person will have an opportunity to sort of present a snapshot of what they feel is important, how they overwinter bees in their particular region. And then we'll have a question and answer period at the end of that specific to overwintering. And then beyond that, we'll open it up to more broader questions on beekeeping that we'll pose to our panelists this evening. I do have one request for those of you that, that have been on these before, and actually for those that haven't. There is a question panel as part of this little login feature that we've got here, this webinar, that you can type in questions. What I'll do is I'll read those questions aloud and then pose it to the person most appropriate based on your geographic region. So in order to do that, I need to know roughly where you're located. So if you could, just at the start of your question, just say Shane, North Carolina. And that way, as I get into your question, I know where best to direct it, which person might be most appropriate. And of course, all three of our panelists are well-versed in beekeeping. So all of them, I'm sure, might have some feedback and information to share with us, but I'll at least get it started with the person that's probably most similar to your climate. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone listening in, and especially our three panelists for helping us out here this evening. And with that, we'll get started with Michael Palmer, who's, like I said, up in very, very northern Vermont. Mike, why don't you take it away?
Okay. Hey, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you're all here, and we hope we can solve some of your wintering problems. This is actually just the autumn and winter preparation section of another talk I've done on my yearly management. But next slide. Shane. Hello. So when do you start your winter preparations? Well, it's often said that you should start in August by recleaning your hives. But maybe you should start a little earlier, like June. Well, maybe you should start a little earlier, like May. So when do you start? Well, the bees are preparing for the winter all year long by trying to build the biggest colony they can to harvest and store as much honey as they can to make it through the next winter. So I'm not really going to go into what it's all about summer management and what we should be doing in our colonies so that they can produce the large clusters that are necessary in the north, like requeening and varroa and tracheal mite control. I think maybe somebody else will talk about that. I'm assuming that your colony has a good prolific queen, reasonably young, with a large cluster, and they're going into the fall flow and past the fall flow, and you need to know what to do to prepare your hive for winter. The bees are preparing themselves. We have to know what to do to prepare the hive. Nick, oh yes. Okay, so you have a little bit more honey. Go back one. You have a little bit more honey to take off. And you have to ask yourself, should you take off all the honey? Could you go back one slide? Should you take off the last super of honey and feed back sugar? I mean, isn't that more economical? And don't you get more honey that way? Well, don't forget, in this picture from the hive and the honeybee, you see the dark band. That's the pollen stores for next spring. So if you take off the top box of honey, you're actually removing the pollen stores for next spring. So it's really a wise thing to do, to leave on honey. Don't try to take off the honey and feed them back sugar. Next slide. I like to go into winter with large clusters. I like to maintain my colonies all year long with large clusters, which is why I don't split these anymore in the springtime. I instead requeen and repopulate with nukes. But I found a very easy way to check your cluster size. I just go down the row of bees and I tip up the top box. And I stand it on its end and I let it sit there for 10 minutes. And it's not very long before the bees come and show themselves to you. And so you can see the first two hives in the row have beautiful clusters, but the third one down looks like it might be lacking some bees. So that's how you can tell immediately how big your clusters are. If you find anything that's too weak, that you think is too weak to winter in your area, then you can unite them. You know, I think that big clusters are really the way to go when entering the winter. And that takes work all summer long. It takes work requeening early, not in August. Requeening in August is a last gasp attempt to try to save a colony. Requeening should be going on all year long. Spring requeening for the ones that need it in the spring. Summer requeening for colonies that aren't quite so productive. That's how you build large clusters. And I think that with large clusters, a lot of the problems I hear with bees are my bees got stuck on one side of the hive and starved to death. I really think with large clusters, bees don't get stuck on one side of the hive and starve to death. Next slide. One thing that you have to make sure that you don't enter the winter with any American foul brood disease. I think this is touched on somewhere else in the program, but I have to say the same thing. You know, it's an absolute cardinal rule that your bees don't go into winter with American foul brood. And the way you do that is you check every colony when you remove the honey. You remove the honey, you put it in an upturned cover, you look through the hive, you make sure there's no foul brood, you take the honey home. If there's foul brood, you put the honey back on and cover it, and you deal with the hive later. But you never remove honey from the apiary from a colony that's got foul brood. So you've got your bees into the fall, through the fall flow. You've removed what honey you think you should. You've got nice-sized clusters. You don't have any disease. But now you have to feed, because some of the colonies aren't, I just lost my feed here. Some of the colonies are going to be light. Did I seem to have lost my my picture here. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. What do you need, Mike?
I don't have my my slides up on my.
You lost your feed. Do you have
I have the PDF. I can go through it that way.
Okay. We're looking at the picture of the burning ABF.
Okay, so go to the next slide.
Okay. We're talking about feeding. It's just a slide with feeding.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about feeding. I feed with syrup cans because I like to put the cans directly on the top bars. I hear a lot of problems with robbing with feeding with cans. I think that's because people feed on top of the inner cover and the syrup rolls down the inner cover and out a crack and it starts robbing. If they're directly on the frames or on little shims with an empty hive body around it, the bees actually warm the syrup in the cans. So how much do you feed? Well, I've heard that you should feed until the bees don't take anymore. Well, that's really overkill. If I was to do that with all my bees, they'd eat me out of house and home. But if you look at that photo, that drawing of the brood nest in winter, you'll notice that there's cluster space between the frames. And the bees actually cluster in the cells. So if you were to fill that hive totally full and made the bees, you'd be making the bees cluster between frames of honey and feed, which isn't good. They need to have clustering space. So no, you don't need to feed until they won't take anymore. So how do you know how much to feed? Well, I've come up with a target weight for my area, and I like to bring my colonies, which are 2 deeps and a medium, to about 155 pounds. And I do that by weighing the bees, weighing the beehives. There's a slide of my scale on a piece of plywood. And you can see my hive stands. Go to the slide. I can't see these slides. If you go to the slide of me tipping the hive.
I'm there now.
Okay, you can see I take the cover off the hive and I place it at the end of the hive stand on the ground, and it's the same height as the 2x4 hive stand. And my scale is on a plywood, and I slide that under the hive, and then I tip the hive up onto the scale, and I read it. I wonder why I can't get that. And so I think that a 2-hive body hive with bees and bottom board and inner cover, but no honey at all, weighs around 70 pounds. So you add to that whatever you think that you need to winter for your bees. If you need 80 pounds, you add 80 pounds to that 70, and you come up with 150. So that's how you come up with a target weight. So when you weigh your beehive, you write the number on the back. And for every 10 pounds under your target weight, you need to feed 1 gallon of 2-to-1 sucrose syrup. You need to feed that all at once. You can put up to 5 gallons on a hive at one time with gallon cans with an empty hive body around it and the cover on top. And if you feed it all at once, they'll take it down, they'll store it, they'll even cap it if you do it early enough in the season. You can't wait until it's cold out and then start feeding your bees, because the bees need to ripen the sucrose syrup. They need to remove some of the water. And in fact, they'll cap it just like they do honey. If you feed it too late in the season, you're just going to have a moisture problem. So you feed 1 gallon of syrup for every 10 pounds light you are. Feed it all at once, and it'll be gone in a week, and the feeding will be done. Now, in the north here, I like to wrap my bees. I like to wrap my bees because not to try to keep the heat in, but the black tar paper is a heat sink. It absorbs heat from the hot sun on a cold day and allows the bees to move around in the hive and get to new honey stores. But it also helps them on those marginal days in early spring when they haven't had a cleansing flight yet, and you get a day that's almost warm enough, but not quite, the bees can take a cleansing flight close to the hive where it's warm. And it's for me, it's long times without cleansing flights is what is most damaging to my bees. Let's go to the first picture of the beehive with a tar paper and string.
I'm there.
Okay. Now this is a hive that's wrapped for winter. Got tar paper wrapper on it. Cover is tied down. Got a screen protection in the bottom entrance for mouse protection. Go to the next slide. This is what you need to wrap a hive. Piece of tar paper, piece of styrofoam that's the same size as the inner cover, little duct tape, a mouse screen, little baling twine, and a staple gun. Next slide. First thing you do is you cut a piece of tar paper, 15-pound felt, 78 to 80 inches long. Next slide. And you fold down the top. You could put it around the hive the way it is, but then it would be too high, right? And so you fold it over like a package. But by doing so, it traps moisture under it. So what I do is I fold down the top so that it's now just the height of the beehive from the bottom board to the inner cover. Next slide. This is the hive that we're gonna wrap. I think it's either 3 hive bodies or 2 hive bodies in a medium. I can't tell from the picture. Next slide. Take the cover off. You can see the burr comb all over the inner cover. Next slide. Picture of the inner cover with the escape hole and the burr comb. I like to scrape that all up so when I put the styrofoam on top, it contacts the wood. Next slide. I tape the inner cover escape hole so the bees won't chew a hole in the styrofoam. Next slide. You should be showing the entrance with the mouse screen out front. That's just a wedge of half-inch hardware cloth, the same length as the space between the 2 cleats of the bottom entrance. And that's shoved into the entrance. Next slide. And the springiness holds it in there. And it's tight enough and the holes are small enough so mice can't get in. But bees can drag their dead out, and there's plenty of ventilation for the winter. Next slide. Shows the upper entrance and the styrofoam on top. You can see how the styrofoam contacts the plywood or the flat side of your inner cover. If you have a rim around your inner cover, you want to make sure that the styrofoam sits fully on the rim so there's no air leaks. So then next slide shows the colony that's ready, the hive that's ready to wrap. Styrofoam on top is the inner cover insulation. That insulates the inner cover so when the bees transpire, water vapor doesn't hit a cold inner cover and condense. It goes out that entrance instead. Sometimes on a cold morning, you'll see a horizontal icicle sticking out 1 inch or 2 out of that entrance on a real cold morning, or all frosted. As soon as the sun comes out and it warms up a little bit and that tar paper warms up, that icicle or that frost melts right out and you have a nice upper entrance, which is needed here for not only for ventilation but for winter flights, because our bottom entrances, in fact, sometimes the entire hive, this hive, is covered with snow. Next slide shows a photo of me installing the wrapper. Put the wrapper around the hive about just maybe 1/2 inch below the styrofoam. Pull it tight, get it tight, even all the way around. Pull it tight in the back. Next slide. And there's a couple pictures. One is the back of the hive. You can see you just put 3 staples in it. See how it's below the top of the styrofoam so it doesn't get pushed down by the cover, and it allows for a little bit of ventilation there from around the outside of the hive. And then you can see a nice shot of the upper entrance. Next slide. the upper entrance with a couple of staples to hold the tar paper. Don't forget that upper entrance hole. And then the next slide is a picture of the hive, fully wrapped. Bottom entrance is screened, top entrance is open. You can see there's a string tying down the cover. You know, if a hive tips over in the wintertime and the cover falls off, the hive is dead. But I have had many tip over in the winter with the cover tied down like that and had the bottom fully opened, and the hive lived through the winter that way, as long as they tipped frontwards or backwards. And the next slide is a nice nuke yard that's got production colonies on the bottom and nucleus colonies on top, and everything all wrapped up for winter, all the entrances open and waiting for the first big snowstorm. Next slide. Thanks all for listening.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. We've got a lot of questions here. I'm going to save a good portion of them for the very end, but one that I think is sort of appropriate that we hear a lot about, especially from the northern climates, that I would like to pose right now is about screened bottom boards. First off, Mike, do you use them? And second, what do you think about leaving them open or closed?
I don't use them, so I don't really have an opinion about leaving them open or closed.
Okay. I think, as I recall, actually, Kim, you're going to probably touch on that just a little bit later on too, aren't you?
Yeah, I think Shane, the short answer is if you've got screen bottom boards and you've got exposed bottoms, that is, you're up on a hive stand without any windbreak, I close mine partially, not completely, probably about 2/3, because I'm like Mike, I want extreme ventilation.
Mm-hmm.
If I've got them up on a hive stand and I can throw something and create essentially a dead air space, then I won't close them at all.
Okay. There is one question here that I just noticed about entrance reducers. Mike, you put in a screen there that prevents mice from getting in the colony, but do you restrict the entrance at all to sort of prevent drafts or something like that from getting into the colony?
No, I don't do that. I think that restricting them like that in my area is a mistake, because you get all the dead, soggy bees that build up behind that little entrance, and you know, there's not enough ventilation for here. You know, the total ventilation is whatever goes in goes out, and if you only have a little restricted entrance, not much ventilation is happening. They're much drier with a fully open entrance with a screen in it like that.
Okay. Well, like I said, we've got a lot of questions here. I'm going to save most of them here for later on in the program, because some of them may be addressed as we move along. And so now we're going to move on to Harry Fulton down in Mississippi, who is the retired state apiarist down there. Again, has a wealth of experience and knowledge dealing with beekeeping in the southern climates. And Harry, I'd like to thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to you. Whoops, hold on one second. I think I've got you muted. There you go. I've unmuted you to help with our sound quality. So Harry, why don't you take it away? Harry?
Can you hear me now?
We can. You're sounding a little faint there. Go ahead, try again.
It is a privilege to be here. It's my first experience doing this, so please bear with me. As most of you probably understand now, overwintering and fall management in the deep south is very different from what Mike explained. In Mississippi, we have a large, kind of a lengthy state north to south, and from one end of the state, you know, things are going to be a little bit different. Seasons vary. I've learned from experience that about for every 70, 80 miles you go north, a difference of about a week occurs in the colony build up in the spring
and other environmental effects. So a month's difference can make a big change in strategy that you need to do. In South Mississippi, generally speaking, fall and winter may be very short, October through November, and winter may just be a few weeks really on the Gulf Coast. Whereas in North Mississippi, winters could be a month longer. So fall in September, probably through October, and then the winter's going to be November through January usually. Next slide. Flows are different, and you have to do your management and your feeding in the fall accordingly, and your honey harvesting accordingly. But as Mike explained, it's always much better to leave honey on the hives than take all the honey and then feed them syrup back. Honey flows depend largely on several factors. The soil type is a big one. Most people overlook it. The environmental effects and temperature, and of course the floral sources make a difference also. So from north to south, you see a variation here. You get hardly any honey flow in the fall on the coastal area, and it's spotted up through the other parts of the state. You can even get a surplus of 80 to 100 pounds in some cases in September and early October. Next slide. Okay, I'm sorry I got those. But anyway, in the deep south, I'm probably speaking from Mississippi, Alabama, maybe parts of Louisiana and Arkansas. But there are things to do that I think Mike covered a lot of that, but we need to teeter a little bit for south. Of course, remove your honey and excess supers, queen excluders, remove those. Check your hive populations. Mike showed you how to check it in the north, and your queen status to make sure you've got a good queen. Unite weak hives. I will point out that in the south, Mike needs big clusters in the north to overwinter. In the south, particularly on the coast, you can overwinter bees in a much smaller cluster because winter is much shorter. You need to remove any frames of foundation that weren't drawn because bees need cluster space, and like Mike said, they need to cluster in combs, in cells. You need to do your mite and disease control measures in the fall, and of course food supplies is critical. Entrance reducers are important here. Bees still need a lot of ventilation. I personally do not use entrance reducers. I think the more ventilation, the better. Cold does not kill bees. It's other factors, as Mike suggested, like moisture and clogging the entrance with dead bees and so forth. And then we do have a problem with livestock, and you have to make sure your bees are protected from livestock during the winter. In warm days during the summer, they can protect themselves, but in the winter, they're closed up. Next slide. Another few things to consider is, vandalism can occur in the winter, particularly guns. People like to target shoot hives for some reason. So put your hives in a safe place from vandalism. Cold winds in the south are not that big a deal, but they can be up north, of course. Bees, I think, do overwinter better in the full sun. Next slide. Excluders, remove them. This picture, next, just go ahead and click again, Shane. I think we missed a picture there, but that's okay. Everybody, I just want to show what queen excluders look like for those that don't know or beginners. In Mississippi, we prefer to overwinter with 2 brood boxes in the northern part of the state. That way they will have adequate food supplies. In the south, particularly on the coast from, say, the southern 70 miles or so, you can overwinter bees easily in one brood chamber. And they prefer a drawn comb. Like I said earlier, don't leave foundation in there. The bees will chew it up, and you'll end up losing it anyway. Go ahead. Next slide. In your fall inspection, you need to look for signs of a queen, of course, to make sure you've got a queen. If you don't have a queen, it's probably getting too late to re-queen and to have to build up strength again. But so you need to be prepared to unite hives and store up queenlets. Of course, you need to look for disease and make sure there's no signs of disease. But next slide. Of course, look for disease and look for the queen. You can do that, signs of a queen. You can do that all at the same inspection. Of course, if you see eggs and they're singly placed in the bottom of a cell, usually that's a good sign you've got a queen. A brood pattern needs to be good and strong and solid. As you see in the upper right hand of this slide, compared to the bottom right slide, you see a very patchy spot of brood, and this is a sign that you've got a drone-laying queen, and she needs to be, this hive was probably on its way out and probably just be lost, but you can combine it. Next slide. So what makes a good queen? The brood pattern is what most people, I showed you a slide of what to look for. Can't go by looks alone, as some beginner hobby beekeepers think. And a good solid brood pattern is the best test you can use on a queen. So really you have to wait until she starts laying for a couple of 3 weeks before you can really judge a queen. Next slide. And this shows you a good solid brood pattern of seal brood. That's what you really look for. Next slide. I've discussed this already, so let's just skip on over a little bit. Again, that's the same slide I showed you a little bit closer up where you've got a drone-laying queen. Pollen. Mike mentioned pollen, the importance it plays in the fall and winter. In Mississippi, we don't really, in the deep south, we don't worry about pollen too much. Bees normally can gather enough pollen in the fall and early spring to really survive and do well. On occasion, we do have a drought in the fall, and the pollen may be poor quality, but that's pretty seldom. So we don't really need to feed pollen in the south. If we do, if any of you do decide you need to feed pollen, make sure you know the source of it, because it can be a source of disease. Next slide. This is kind of reiterates what Mike said. In Mississippi, in the north part, 50 to 70 pounds of food should be needed for winter, and this is kind of shows you how it should be arranged. In the south, much less is needed, 30, 35 pounds. Will get you by on the deep part of the state, south part. Next slide. And honey needs to be really compacted in that hive for good overwintering. Some beekeepers over-super in the fall, and for that reason the bees tend to store too much honey in the honey super, and they don't want to move it down and store it compacted in those 2 brood chambers for winter. And this is what it really should look like. That top brood chamber, when it's ready for winter, should be packed full of honey. Go ahead, next slide. Starvation. Mike mentioned feeding. You don't want to wait too late in the fall to feed, even in the deep south. If you don't get a fall flow, you'll know it pretty quick, and you need to start feeding. Here you see some signs of the bees are starving, and at this point, you're probably way, way behind the 8 ball. Anytime you see bees crawled in the upper left-hand corner, you see a slide of bees. They have crawled inside the cells head first. You'll see no nectar, no honey in the hive, and the bees are starving. It's probably about too late to bring them back. Particularly in the fall, that's too late. That hive will be lost for sure. On the right top, you'll see a slide, a comb of bees that are starving, very little brood. You'll see pollen a circle of pollen around what a little brood did, but you see no nectar, no no syrup or anything in the hive. Bees can't live on bread alone. And in the bottom two slides, you'll see brood that's been neglected. It's not fed, it's dying. Bees are actually chewing and eating the brood themselves because they need the protein and so forth. Next slide. And in this case, you'd need to emergency feed the bees to try to bring them back if you think it's possible. And you can spray syrup in the combs on the bees themselves where they can pick it up quickly. Dry sugar is not a good emergency feed, but it can be used in the winter. A sprinkle on the combs and even dribble down to the bottom board where the bees can pick it up. Now you have to realize that they still have to process that dry sugar into liquid, and that takes away from them in the winter. It's really not that efficient. In the north, I understand they do feed sugar candy. That's a good way to feed bees during the winter months. Go ahead. The winter brood nest needs to be very tight, as I explained earlier, with honey all around, packed tight in those two brood boxes. For that reason, you don't need to over-super your bees in the fall or make them put that honey down where it needs to be for winter, unless you know for sure you can make surplus honey. Next slide, or next click. Bees, you may not see pollen when you look in there, but normally when they store honey in the fall, they'll top of of the pollen. Next click, please. Again, I want to reiterate again, no foundation. They need combs. Go ahead, next slide. Two brood chambers, perfectly. One in the south, it's okay. Next slide. I'm kind of reading. And a good picture of a brood pattern going into the winter. I'd say in the south that's a good slide for about the 1st of October. A good picture. Next slide. So brood, how much brood is needed? And the thing I want to really stress here that there can be too little. I just explained that the bees need to pack that honey in the brood chambers for winter, but at the same time they can do too much of that. If you get a real strong flow, they can actually fill those two brood boxes completely full of honey nearly, and the queen has no place to lay, and so the population is going to become weak very quickly. And you don't want that and you need to watch that. The queen needs a space to lay on into October and November. Next slide. If the clusters are not what you think they should be in the south, then we probably need to have at least a 3 to 4 pound cluster to overwinter. And realizing a 3 or 4 pound cluster is going to be pretty weak coming out of the winter and be real slow building up. You need 6 to 8 pounds of bees, preferably, or more, to overwinter in the deep south to do a good job and build up. So unite those hives that are weak. You come out a lot better in the long run. And I'm not going into the different types of uniting, but the newspaper method is probably the most popular. Go ahead. In the deep south, you need to be aware of robbing. Mike mentioned that earlier. If you're a sloppy beekeeper, you try to work your bees when there's no nectar flow. Robbing can be a problem. It's just something you need to avoid, and you need to be aware of it. Go ahead, next slide. The next slide, how do you recognize robbing? The bees are fighting at the entrances. They're flying into frenzy all in the bee yard. They're more aggressive than usual. You have to have your bell on, usually. And the bees are humming real loud. There's a hum in the yard, and of course, there's no nectar flow usually when that happens. Next slide. Disease and mite control is very important. A sick hive, whether it's mites or foul brood or European foul brood or anything else, virus, nosema, is going to overwinter poorly, or if at all. And I don't don't have time to go in all the measures for mite and disease control. Just be aware that you need to do all that you can in the fall to make sure that those bees are healthy going into the winter. Next slide. Skunks can be a problem in the south. I don't know about north, but in the winter when the bees are clustered, particularly early spring, the skunks can really dig in and knock a hive down in population and make them mad and aggressive. And so you have to do things to stop that if it comes out. I found out one good home remedy is to get some habanero pepper sauce and sprinkle around the hives. Once they get their feet in there and lick it, they don't come back. So, next slide. So final fall checklist, food supply. South, 30, 40 pounds. North, 50 plus to 70 pounds. Queen, you need a good young queen. Health, issues, treated for mites and diseases. Protection, entrance reducers, which are not really necessary except if you want to have protected from mice. The livestock, from flooding is a very big issue. Chilling, wind chills are not a big issue in the south like they are in the north, and vandalism. So next slide, I think we're just about through. A few things that you need to do during December and January is keep checking on your food stores and make sure the hives are upright, not knocked over, as Mike said, with the lids off. Those are management things you need to do, and even in extreme south Mississippi, you can still apply your mite and fire blue treatments during these months because you have temperature. When you can work bees year-round down there, generally speaking, if you don't work them too long, you can do management year-round. There'll be a little brood year-round on the Gulf Coast in most cases. Next slide, I think it's the last one. February, still check food stores, and by then the bees should be bringing in a lot of pollen. In South Mississippi, they're going to bring some pollen in year-round, but in the spring build-up's going to start in January on the coast and build up quickly in February because they have surplus good honeyfoes from maple and spring tie-tie starting in February. And during that period, it's time to make your first spring inspection around February 15th in North Mississippi if the weather's permitting above 60 degrees. That first inspection is very important. Next slide, I think that's all, though.
That slide brings us into Kim, but before we move on to Kim, Harry, I just have a couple of questions here. First off, this one's coming from Vermont, but is specific to you regarding that skunk repellent. There's some people interested in that. What was that magic solution again?
Get some of the hottest pepper you can get, preferably liquid spray or liquid like habaneros, hot sauce, and sprinkle it around the hive entrance where they're scratching, and they get it on their feet and start licking their feet. They'll get a fight up. And it worked once for me in a bee yard, and that's the reason I'm saying it works.
All right. Also, you mentioned that you don't necessarily use entrance reducers, that you think ventilation is an important part of successful overwintering, similar to Mike up in Vermont. But in the South, I lived up in New York for a bit, came down to North Carolina, and have sort of experienced the phenomenon of robbing like I had never seen before moving down to this area. How do you suggest dealing with robbing? Is that a problem in Mississippi? Because it certainly is in our neck of the woods here in North Carolina. Without that entrance reducer in, you can have some real problems, especially if you're trying to feed.
Well, the entrance reducers should be put in later in the season if you're going to use them, after you're through feeding or whatever you're going to be doing. Now, if robbing starts, then you know, you have to close the hive up, and some beekeepers say you just take the lids off every hive in the bee yard and that'll stop it because they have to protect their own house. But and I don't know if that works from experience. I haven't tried it, but probably once it starts, it's a problem. You have to close those hives up that are being robbed, and preferably if you're going to be working your bees in the fall when there's no nectar flow, do it late in the afternoon, because the bees will have, you know, nighttime be coming, and they won't have a problem the next day then.
Okay. I'm not sure if I mentioned this to our three panelists, but I'll mention it now given the volume of questions that I've got coming in. When I advertised this, I said that there was no question that the three of you could not answer. And so you have a very, very daunting challenge ahead of you once we finish off with Kim's portion. So I'll just you know, warn you about that, what's coming up here in the next segment. Harry, I'm gonna just I want to thank you for that. I'm gonna put you on mute now so that we can turn this over to Kim. Kim Flottum is our next presenter. He's in Ohio, also the editor of Bee Culture magazine, and he's gonna sort of fill in some gaps here a bit and discuss some other aspects to consider when thinking about overwintering. So Kim, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Thanks, Shane. Yes, I want to talk about some things that Mike and Harry, I'm not going to say made assumptions of, but I want to look at some of the details a little closer here. And go ahead and change the slide, Shane. One of the things, obviously, that everybody knows already, politics like beekeeping like politics is local, and what works for me here in Ohio or what worked for me in Wisconsin when I was there, I can tell you exactly how to do it. Mike can tell you Vermont, Harry can tell you Mississippi, and I go 30 miles either direction, east or west of me, and it's going to be different, and it's going to be way different for almost everybody. So what works for me may or may not work as well for you. And a lot of it has to do with what kind of a beekeeper you are. And go ahead and change the slide, Shane. What kind of a beekeeper you are, what kind of bees you have, and what kind of philosophy you have. And I want you to look at this picture right now. And the question is, why did these bees die? And too often, we as beekeepers say, well, they starved. And my question then is, why did they starve? Well, starvation can be because they didn't have enough food, or the food was in the wrong place. Perhaps they became wet from condensation, and the water dripped down. They got cold and died from that problem. Sometimes pests and disease got a colony. Not enough bees. Mike looked at a nice picture of enough bees on there. My contention is that all of these problems are preventable, and honeybees should not die over winter. Every one of these things that are listed here are situations that beekeepers should be managing to avoid or prevent. So let's look quickly at those. Go ahead, Shane. One thing I want to before we address what kind of bees is how bees starve in a colony. What goes on, and Mike had a good picture there of and made good comments about enough bees in a colony, and he said that there's bees in cells and there are bees up against honey, but of course there are bees that are up against just empty comb on both sides of them. How do they get food? And how they get food is the same way bees transfer food. When a forager comes in from the field, she transfers her nectar load to a bee who takes it from her and then moves it somewhere in the colony. The bees in a cluster are doing the same thing. They're taking food, they're taking honey from a cell, and they're eating what they need, and then they're passing it along to their nestmates. And as long as there are some bees near honey, all bees are near honey. It's when there aren't any bees near any honey that they run out of food. So if you've got enough bees to go side to side, and down into the depth of the frame, you're probably not going to have any problem with honey being in the wrong places. When you've got a small cluster that can't get over to because of the temperature, then the beekeeper then needs to look at the number of bees. Now, what happens when bees are in a cluster in the winter? There's no regulator going on in a cluster. There's no boss. The queen isn't doing it. There's no boss that says, okay, slow down, girls. We've only got this much food, and if we all cut back a little bit, the food's going to last a whole lot longer, and we'll all live until spring. What happens is that all of the bees are eating all that they want, and then they all run out, and that's why you find a cluster of bees that's pretty much dead. Instead of, they don't start reserving some and saving the queen and saving the young and all of that. What happens is that they all eat what they need, and then they all die at about the same time. So knowing that bees don't have to be exactly on honey to get honey, you need enough bees, and they're all going to eat, and they're all going to run out of food at the same time. Looking at the slide here, what kinds of bees that you're using are certainly going to make a difference on the cluster size that you have and on how these bees are going to overwinter. I got Italian right in the middle. That's what most people are using. Italians are a semi-tropical bee, and they love to eat. And if you've got Italians, the one thing you better be aware of is that they like to eat. They're going to have a big population, or they should have, and they're going to eat a lot of food. So going into winter, you know that you're going to need as much food as Mike leaves on to get through spring, not through winter, to get through spring. You don't want them running out of food in February, March. So if you got Italians, they're going to eat more. On the left, Carniolans, second most popular bee that we've got, probably smaller cluster. They don't use as many bees in the winter. As a result, they don't use as much food. They are very observe the resources during the summer and during the honey flows. And in the winter, they're going to use less food just because they go into winter with fewer bees. Russians, on the other hand, over on the other side, this very similar to Carniolans in that they go into winter with small clusters and eat less food. This is going to be a very good advantage for you as a beekeeper if honey is your business. It certainly makes wintering easier for them when they don't have to have 70, 80, 90 pounds of honey. And it makes it easier for you as a beekeeper to get the honey in the right place. The cluster, as the cluster sits there, it warms the air. The warm air rises, and the bees follow that warm air plume right up to the top of the hive. If you've got a lot of bees, you got honey all over the side, just to have enough honey in the colony, and getting bees over to the side later in the winter sometimes can be problematic. Okay, Shane. Just where your bees are, Shane mentioned he was in North Carolina and he spent time in New York, and life was different in both places. But where you keep your bees in the winter, just the physical location is going to make a difference. Shane, you may recognize that picture up in the upper left-hand corner. That's Brushy Mountain's bee yard there. There's a spot there in the center in the Rockies. Down in Harry's, Mississippi, over on the right, one of my Wisconsin hive bee yards covered with snow. Certainly the desert is going to have way different kinds of problems and advantages. When you see a lizard on your beehive, you know that you're not in Ohio anymore. If you're in urban beekeeping, and there seems to be a big increase in that. If you've got hives on the roof, you've got to contend with wind, and you've got to contend with that kind of cold exposure. Perhaps you were in the country last year and that subdivision went up. Is that going to make any difference to what you're doing and things that you need to do different? And if you've got a colony in the backyard, which is where I have mine, I can see them from my house. I can walk down and check them every day. I don't have them isolated out in an apiary someplace, so I've got a little. I can babysit them a little bit more and maybe get a colony through winter that isn't quite as good as you'd like it to be, but because I'm there every day, I can take care of it. Okay, Shane. Everybody's talked about getting rid of pests and diseases. MITE, certainly you've been monitoring all summer and doing all of the IPM things that keep the populations low. AFB, certainly burn mice you keep out. Wax moth, probably not a problem. Where the north half of the U.S. is, where Harry is, it can be kind of an issue. And up in the top there is the bugaboo that Shane and I were talking about earlier, and I don't think we've got resolved. Is what do you do about nosema? And with the new nosema that's come along, there just aren't good symptoms. Without testing and taking samples and sending them into Beltsville and counting spores, you don't know what your situation is. Doing all of the things right during the summer, making sure your bees aren't stressed, that they've got lots of food, that it's good food, that they're eating it, that they're getting some of the food supplements, the essential oil supplements that seem to be helping. But again, continuing to test. Your last choice is probably an antibiotic, and maybe it's not a choice at all. If bees are putting food on your table, that's a perspective you're going to have. If it's a hobby in the backyard, then you've got another perspective on what you want to put in your hive. But nosema is the tricky, and I don't have a good answer for that right now. Let me rephrase that. I have lots of answers for that right now, of which you can choose the one that's best for you, I guess. Shane, you can change that, please. Most of these have been addressed. Have enough honey, have enough food in your hive, enough brood going in, so that you enough brood and enough young bees. And I think young bees are probably even more important than brood going in. But certainly that brood up in that top frame is going to turn into young bees very soon. What you want is bees that are, like 3 or 4 weeks, 6 weeks old when they go into cluster, so that they're not 6 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks old, so that they last until May, and they're still able to actively forage and actively take care of young. What you want is a lot of young bees. You want enough pollen going in there. Mike had one way to weigh a hive. Here's another one. You weigh the front, you weigh the back. You add the two. And you come up with about the right weight. If I use that kind of a scale, I'll get about 155 pounds on a 150-pound colony, which is the way the math works out for reasons unknown. But about 150 pounds is what I'm looking for on a bottom board, 2 deeps, inner cover and a cover, and the honey and bees and pollen inside. Harry mentioned removing queen excluders. Emergency feeding is something you shouldn't have to do. It's a management mistake that you got yourself into, and now you're having to scramble. 2 ways to do it. Dry sugar, the least popular way, but it's a way to get carbohydrates into the colony. The candy boards work well. Picture down on the bottom there, you take sugar and a little bit of water, and you boil it until it reaches, I think it's 242 degrees. Get it into one of those boards and let it harden, and you put that board right over on top of the cluster when they're in the top of the colony, which is where they'll be. The old adage that says the top is the bottom in winter is when your bees have reached the top of your hive, they are at the bottom of their reserves, so they will be right at the top of your colony. So this is an easier way to feed them. Of course, the baker's fondant is another way to get that stuff on there. Baker's fondant is easy to use. There's no labor involved. It's a mixture of cane sugar and, unfortunately, high fructose corn syrup. So you've got that to deal with. But in an emergency, you're doing things you shouldn't have to be doing anyway. It's just one more. Having a good queen going into who's requeening in the summer. Mike said requeening all year long. Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Patching up holes and cracks and crevices just to keep the wind out and robbing out later in the fall certainly makes good sense. Go ahead and change it, Shane, please. Windbreaks are certainly, no matter where you are, windbreaks are going to help when you got bees who can't move around and kind of protect themselves. So any kind of a windbreak is going to help. Mike talked about wrapping, and boy, I tell you, I'm coming to think more and more that this is a better thing to do. It's one less stress we're putting on our bees if we can get them bundled up for the winter. and as he said, it doesn't keep them warm, but it helps warms the colony so that they can move a little bit. We did wrapping when we were at the USDA Bee Lab in Madison. In Madison, the big red W at the University of Wisconsin stands for winter. We had bees that never clustered. We were able to wrap them so well. They were so snug that the temperature inside the colony didn't get to the point where they had to cluster. They ate a lot of food, but they came out of the winter really strong. So I think we need to revisit good wrapping, and there's a lot of ways to do it. There's the boxes, and then there's the plastic wrap, and then there's, like Mike was doing with the roofing paper. You can change that. Shane, Mike talked about tying his cover down. I screw mine down. I just put a screw on each side of the cover, and then I don't worry about it. You can get really excited here about wintering if you want to do the wrapping and the bundling and all of that. The very simple picture over there is the way Richard Taylor wintered his hives. He had a medium on the bottom and a deep on the top, and he tilted them forward, and he stapled a piece of tar paper over the front entrance and had a mouse guard underneath that, and that was it. And that worked for Richard in Ithaca, New York for all of the years he was there. So you can get very sophisticated indoor wintering with air conditioning and CO2 removal and all of those things. Or you can do it pretty simple, but if you meet the basic requirements of the bees, all of these things work depending on where you are. Okay, Shane, I think we're done.
We are indeed. Let me just take care of some things here. There we go. We've got, let me pull up my questions panel, and what I'm going to do is we've got all four of us live right now. All four of us are able to speak. I've unmuted every one of our panelists. I'll just mention that sometimes when we've got multiple mics active, that we just need to be aware we need to speak up a little bit louder so that our audience can hear us. We've got a lot of questions, and I'm just going to take them one at a time here. We've got sort of a general question. What type of feeder do you prefer? A top feeder? If so, what type? A division board, baggy, pail, etc. And we'll just go around the table, starting with Mike. How do you use the cans?
Yeah, I use paint cans that are epoxy lined. New paint cans, you can buy them at paint stores. Put some 6 or 8 penny holes in the cover. I put them on shims that I cut on my table saw, 3/8 shims. And I like that because the bees actually don't have to break cluster like they do with a hive top feeder or a division board feeder or an in-hive feeder. They have to break cluster to get the syrup. These guys, they can cluster right on the cans. In fact, they do, and they warm the syrup. So they can really take down a lot of syrup in a week, even in cold weather.
Okay, and Harry?
My first thought is avoid entrance feeders if possible. And other than that, you need to feed the bees inside, as close to the cluster as possible. And whatever you can afford. Top feeders are pretty expensive, and I guess whatever works best for you, other than the entrance feeders, my suggestion.
Okay, and what about you, Kim? How do you feed?
Well, I try to get food on before I have to worry about clustering, but I've got a little longer time than Mike does, so I'm using stuff on top of the top bars with a shim around or a shell around, and then the inner cover, so like you said, they don't rob. But bottles work, and cans work, and baggy feeders work. But I'm doing this in the middle of September, so all of those things work in there and close. I don't worry about robbing.
Okay. We've got several questions here about mite control, and I think we're all on the same page here. And again, we're all able to chime in here. So I'm just, if you guys want to comment on this, feel free. But I think it's safe to say that with the exception of maybe Harry down in Mississippi, that really a lot of that mite control work should have been done. Either it's ongoing or should be done at this point. And I know, Mike, when we had a sort of our practice session earlier or late last week, you were saying you were expecting temperatures in the 30s, and really at that point you needed to have that completed. Is that not right?
Yeah, that's true. It was 33 degrees last night here. And Tim asked a question about what do you do in October when there's 100 mites a day dropping on your varroa board. And, you know, sometimes I think that you have to just give in. I think sometimes you have to admit defeat. And that colony with 100 mites a day dropping in October has probably got the foreign wing virus, and the brood isn't healthy, and they're going to die no matter what you put in the hive. So why would you pollute your hive with whatever you're using if the colony's going to die anyway?
Kim or Harry, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with Mike on that one. My strategy tends to be, as often as I can make it work, is that by the 1st of August, my mite count is approaching 0, but it's because I've been doing stuff all summer long, and drone trapping is my favorite technique. I really like that, but that didn't work very well this year because we didn't have much of a honey flow, and as a result, we didn't have much drone production or drone comb drawing. But it seemed to have worked well enough that my mite drop was in September low enough that I'm not worried about it going into winter. We'll see what happens in May, but I'm done with mites by October 1 certainly.
In Mississippi, I guess, speaking from my opinion, you want to protect that last brood cycle so you'll have those young bees going in the winter, and that's last 21 days of brood rearing. And it's going to vary from one end of our state to another the further you go north. So, you know, you just have to play it by ear and look at Mother Nature and treat when you need to treat to protect that last 21 days of brood rearing.
All right, Kim, I just want to go back to you one more time on this because you've got a great little catchphrase that I think is really important based on what we knew with Varroa and how they vector virus or allow virus levels to increase, and sort of how those viruses then persist a little bit beyond after the Varroa have declined from a mite treatment. And I'm wondering if you can just you know, humor me a bit and give me that catchphrase. I'm hoping you can you know the one I'm referring to.
Well, that's why I'm doing mites as early in the season as I am, because I want to take care of the bees that go into winter. And the bees that go into winter, I want absolutely positively as healthy as can be, well fed, no disease, no mite damage, and not having been taken care of by mite damaged bees, because a larva that's been damaged by a mite grows up to be a damaged bee, and she in turn is less able to care for the next generation. So I'm taking care of the bees that take care of the bees that go into winter. So I've got 2 generations of healthy bees by the time we start forming clusters. And boy, I tell you, I've found that if that middle generation is healthy, then the generation that goes into winter they just pop in the spring. It's a real pleasure to see, but boy, if they go in there damaged, or they're fed by damaged bees, or they're cared for by damaged bees, it just isn't that same pop. Does that make sense?
And that's exactly what I was looking for, that phrase of taking care of the bees. I think we need to shout that from the rooftops. I think that there's a fair number of beekeepers that have fallen into the habit, and they're mentoring new beekeepers. And they've fallen into this habit of, you know, they stick a medicated strip or some sort of mite control measure on a colony in October or November and think that once the mites are dead, the colony is healthy. And I really think we need to shake that that impression. And so that's exactly what I was looking for. Here's a question. It's coming from North Carolina, but I'll pose it to both Mike and Harry, because both of you showed slides of sort of, I guess, the quintessential brood nest, which you like to see going into winter, you know, where the honey should be, where the pollen should be, where the brood space, the cluster space should be. And Harry, you mentioned several times the importance of removing undrawn foundation. And this question is sort of getting to the point of, okay, so if I want that, do I need to sort of go into my hive? Do I need to sort of shuffle things around to sort of try and create that for the bees? How does one go about getting that classic configuration? We'll start with Mike.
Well, I think the bees do it by themselves. As long as we don't put a blockade in front of them, like taking too much honey off. You know, if the colony is strong and they're on a flow, and it's the fall flow, and they're starting to shut down, they know what they're doing. They've been doing this for eons, and they'll pack the honey in the top of the hive and pollen underneath it. So when we start fooling with them is when they have problems. So I think the bees just know how to do it.
And Harry, so when you pull out that undrawn foundation, do you have to sort of go through and do you try and reorganize that colony to create that sort of classic configuration?
The problem with foundation is that the bees can't cluster on it. Of course, there's no honey in it. It's just useless space that's taken up. Now, if you don't have combs to put back in when you take it out and you've got some honey in the combs in the center of the hive, then, you know, if you've got to have it, it's better to have foundation in there on the outside of the comb, on the outside of the hive than it is, you know, nothing at all. But the best thing to do is just, if you got drawn comb, replace it and hopefully feed until they get it full if they don't grow it out.
Okay.
I'm a little fussier sometimes, Shane, and I agree with Mike. They know what they're doing, but sometimes right now, this time of year, when I find a frame that was full of honey 2 weeks ago, and I've got a lot of those right now, and I'm only half full of honey now on one side, I'll flip that frame around and so have the honey facing in. And if they're gonna bring in more, they'll fill out the other side, and that's good. But if they don't bring any more, at least they're closer to it. But Mike's got it about right. They know what they're doing mostly, and I'm probably more meddling than anything.
Well, if they're wearing 2 brood chambers down here and they have empty combs, then the beekeeper needs to feed them until they fill them out.
All right. Mike, you mentioned one of your last slides, we can maybe even pull it up, that here it is, that these are active colonies with nukes on top of them. We've got some questions about overwintering nukes. Can you just give us a quick explanation of what you've got going on here and how you're doing it?
Okay, sure. There's the bottom hive is a production hive, and for instance, the front hive, the tallest one over there on the left, you can see it's up on the inner corner there. You can see that there's a string across the front, and right below it is an entrance. That entrance is actually the upper entrance of the production colony, and what sits on top of the inner cover of that is a nuke box with 2 nukes in it, and you can see there's another white spot up above and to the left of that upper entrance of the production colony. That's the bottom entrance of that nuke. There are actually 2 nukes in that box, and there, you know, the production hive has its wrapper, as I showed before, and then the nuke box has its own little wrapper. So I can take the wrapper off and remove that nuke box and check the bottom hive in the spring and put the nuke back on. It's a lot of lifting, but.
And do you have a lot of success with that method? How would you mind saying how well you do with that?
Yeah, I have about, well, let's see. I took in around, I had 450 going into the winter last year, and I took around 325, 335, something like that out of the winter in good shape.
Those are nukes.
Those are nukes, yes, actually. I also winter mating nukes, which are on little mini frames, 8 mini frames, and I have similar results. I lose 25 to 30% of them probably.
That's better than some beekeepers are doing with full-size colonies. That's quite impressive.
It's pretty amazing that sometimes the nucleus colonies winter better than the production colonies.
That's great. We might have to have you back to talk more about that in detail. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions as a result of your answer there. We've got a question here about queen excluders. I think all three of you mentioned removing those. What's the importance of that?
Well, I'll jump in. If you've got a queen excluder above your brood nest and below your honey supers, as when the colony starts off in the fall, they are probably down in the lower boxes in your brood nest. As the fall and winter progresses and the bees consume the food down below, they begin to move up. They'll move up, and of course a queen excluder does exactly that. It excludes the queen. The bees will move up and continue to move up and eating food, but the queen is trapped below. One of two things happens. Sometimes the bees will not abandon the queen and everybody dies down below. Most often what happens is the bees go up through the queen excluder and the queen dies below. Neither case is acceptable, and getting rid of the queen excluder solves the problem.
I think that's universal, regardless of whether you're in Vermont, Mississippi, or anywhere else. That queen excluder needs to come out. Kim, I'm gonna pose this one to you because I know that you've got a pretty ingenious way of storing your supers going through winter. But what do you do with those? This question is, what do you do with the wet supers after you've harvested them? This person who happens to be in Colorado, but I think it would be the same regardless of where you're located. They've been told that they should put them back on the hive for winter, but also been told not to do that. That there's actually too much dead air space. What should one do with their wet supers, and how might they store them going through winter?
Well, I think you probably get three good answers here because you got three different things going on. Mike's going to be harvesting at a different time than I am. When I'm harvesting, on a good year, I'm harvesting like 3, maybe 4 times, and I'll have supers on. I'll have wet supers back on in May because I'm getting them as soon as I can get them out of where I extract. I need them back on my colonies because I got them to Flottum. I'm not rich in supers, so they're not off the colonies very long. So yes, I put them back on as fast as I can get them, and when I'm done with them in the last harvest in the summer, which is going to be, it's still summer, August, I'm going to put them back on and let them clean them out and dry, and then they get stored either outside under cover or just stacked so the wax moth doesn't get at them. But so yes, I put them back on right away because I need the space and I don't want wet supers, and they're closed in, so robbing isn't an issue. Mike, what do you do with yours? I'd be interested.
Let's see. Well, I pretty much have to stack mine up because I have so many beehives that I just keep stacking them up and stacking them up, and we start harvest about sometime late July, early August. Takes about a month and a half to do harvest, and the hives that we harvest early, when we take the honey off, we check the hive for a weight, and if the hive is already heavy, we have to put a super back on, and if the hive is light and we see brood and black comb, then we don't put a super back on and let the fall flow go in the hive bodies for winter. And then at that point, when we stop using supers, they go on pallets, get stretch wrapped, and they go in my storage shed. And actually, I have a bee yard at home, but also there's bee yards around of other people, and the place gets to be a total freak show with robber bees. And I mean, it gets pretty intense when there's a 15-pound swarm hanging on the ceiling and you can't open the overhead. So I leave some of the supers out available, the wet supers for them, or I leave my shed doors open in the day, and the bees go and rob those, and I can leave my doors open in the honey house, and they don't bother coming in then after that because they're so interested in the wet supers.
And Harry, what?
Cold. It's so cold here. I don't have a problem with waxworms, so I just, keeping them cold is my solution.
Well, that's the opposite of here. We have to worry about wax moths pretty much year-round in Mississippi, parts of Mississippi. So from my experience, we may be extracting honey in October in some parts of the state because the fall flows are pretty good. When you super back for fall, you have to be careful, though. If you've got a brood chamber or two brood chambered hive that hadn't got a whole lot of honey in the two brood chambers and the brood nest is at the top, you put supers on in the fall, they'll fill those up and not put in the brood chambers where you want it for winter. So that can present a problem. But when you harvest down here and you take your honeys off, supers off for winter, there's no problem. Bees will surely rob them out pretty quick. But when you store them, you got several options. You can stack them, put paradichlorobenzene crystals on them to protect them until they're needed next spring. But I found a simple way to do it. If you don't have pollen or had brood in them, stack them under open shed, crisscross them where light can get in them, and they're usually protected. Wax moths don't like light, so if you get enough light in there, you can crisscross them and stack them for winter, and they'll be okay till next winter. Now in extreme south Mississippi, you can have wax moth problems all winter, but north, the winter usually kills them out, and they'll move back in later in the spring, early summer. So the options are basically two there. You either treat them, put them in a chamber and treat them, store them for winter, or leave them stacked in an open shed where they get plenty of light during the winter.
I used a similar method to what Harry described. Actually, both here in North Carolina and when I was up in New York State, I had a shed that had just I built it, so when I built it, I made sure it had a really long overhang. It was about a 4-foot overhang, and I only have about 12 hives, and that allowed me to stack those supers underneath that overhang so they stayed dry. But like Harry was saying, they got some light, they got some ventilation. Of course, they were stored outside, and anything below 32 degrees for any period of time is sufficient to kill off all forms of wax moth. So that worked out pretty well for me, and probably would work out well for most people, except for like Harry was saying, unless you're in extreme south where you've got temperatures and environments that wax moth can survive all year round and be a problem.
Say something about lesser wax moths, if I could.
What's that?
I'd like to say something about lesser wax moths, if I could.
Absolutely, go ahead.
I find that cold weather, freezing weather doesn't kill lesser wax moths. I took lesser wax moth combs out of the storage shed when we'd already had several nights at 20 below 0 Fahrenheit, and I exposed them in my honey house, cleaning up old combs, and I was going to take a picture of them in the morning, and I went back out in the morning and they were gone, and I turned the combs over and they crawled out of the light. I have pictures of frozen solid lesser wax moth larvae warming up, thawing out, and crawling away.
Interesting.
Tony Jadzak in Maine agrees that when you see those little pink worms, if they're not white, if they're pink, they can live through frozen, very cold temperatures. So anyway, it's different.
Well, thank you.
They're not greater wax moths. They're lesser wax moths, and they can live.
We've got a couple questions here about supers. Should I leave them on? How many? I've got an empty brood chamber. you know, how do I get the bees to take that honey out of the supers, get them down in? Should I feed them in that case? You know, so we've got a lot of questions sort of pertaining to, I guess, hive configuration, where the honey is located, should they leave extra supers on? I guess one question here that sort of comes to mind is, for me, I've always worked with the understanding, and my experience has been that too much space is almost as detrimental as not enough space. And so, again, let's just sort of go around the table here. We'll start with you again, Mike, and what are your thoughts about leaving extra supers on a hive to make sure that they have sufficient weight of resources going into winter, or do you think it would be better to actually maybe take that off and feed them at that point?
I guess it depends on your hive. As far as too much room in the hive being detrimental, if the hive didn't have any honey except what was in the supers, I would certainly leave the supers on if that is how they're going to have enough honey for winter. And I don't think it matters, you know, the amount of space underneath the active cluster. You know, when you have no honey in the brood nest and honey only in the supers, the active cluster is located higher in the hive. And I don't think that empty combs below the active cluster is a big problem as long as they have enough honey and pollen stored in the top of the hive.
Okay. Harry?
I agree with what Mike says. The problem when you've got honey in the honey supers and not in the brood nest in the spring, the bees are going to move their brood nest upward, and you're going to have brood in your honey supers to contend with.
Kim?
That's like Harry said. That's the problem when you've got a light, not much down below, and they tend to be in the top deep of the too deep overwintering configuration, and nothing down below. And then you can fuss with reversing and all of these things, but I think Mike's got it right. Is just let them keep moving up. Harry's got it right in that you end up with brood in your honey supers. But if that's where the honey is and they're alive in May, that's not a terrible trade-off. I'd rather have live bees than spend a lot of time trying to do what they seem to be doing better than I am on their own.
You know, if you take the honey supers off and you take them down to that empty brood nest and you feed them all kinds of sugar syrup, where's the pollen for spring?
Yeah,
You remove the pollen, the spring pollen that they're going to replace their dying bees with. You've removed it. All they're wintering on is sugar syrup.
It all gets back to over-supering in the fall or late summer. You just got to learn to know what to expect in your area and not over-super, or they can put that honey where it needs to go.
Exactly.
Along the same lines, we're talking about honey and things like that. We've got some questions about feeding protein. Everyone touched on feeding some form of liquid for the most part, but what about protein supplements? What are your thoughts on that? And again, we'll start with you, Mike.
I don't have to feed a protein supplement in the fall because we have such a big pollen flow from gosh, we have such a great variety of pollens here, but goldenrod and after and just tons of different pollens that they can pack the brood nest. When we have a problem is in the spring. With a delayed spring, they use up all the stored pollen raising brood, and they have no more protein to raise brood, and the queen shuts down right at the time when you don't want the queen to shut down. So it's more in the spring that you feed a pollen substitute or pollen here in the north.
And Harry?
Well, you really, if you're a good beekeeper and manage your bees properly, you don't have to feed pollen supplement anytime unless you really have a dry, dearth fall and the pollen's not very good quality, but you really don't know that usually. The problem we run into down here right now is small hive beetles. If you feed pollen in any form or fashion in a patty, it's going to be a magnet for small hive beetles. And we had beekeepers complain about they fed pollen patties in March this year, and small hive beetles just took over. So that's the biggest problem we've got with feeding. You need to avoid feeding pollen patties at all in the deep south, unless it's wintertime when it's cold, which you don't need to be doing anyway.
One of the things that I look at here is our summer was incredibly hot and not very dry. We had enough rain, but it was incredibly hot. The plants pretty much shut down, and the quality of pollen is an unknown when that happens. They didn't produce much nectar. If I was in Mike's position and I had as many hives as he would have, I got a different perspective. When I'm looking at my dozen or 10 or whatever it got, or I'm talking to people who have not a lot of hives, one of the things that I'll mention is that you know, half a pollen patty on a colony in the fall when you don't know what the quality of the pollen is good insurance. If they need it, they'll eat it. If they don't need it, they won't eat it generally. And if they don't need it, then you can be more comfortable with what they got. In the spring, it's the same thing. Do they have enough? And if you put one on and it's gone and in a couple, 3 days, then you know that there's probably something going on that you need to pay attention to. If it sits there, you know, they probably got everything they need and you don't have to worry about it. But I look at it as insurance sometimes, and it's saved some bees for me.
I think I'd probably, again, given my perspective, I've got 12 hives in my backyard, and while we've got hive beetle here, it's not nearly to the degree that we see in other parts of the country. And given what I've heard at a lot of some of the more recent national meetings, it seems like nutrition is really something that we underemphasize. And I'd side with Kim a bit, saying that, you know, from my perspective, buying a 10-pack of patties and throwing on half a patty if they take it, great. If they don't, or giving it just piecemeal in case if I'm worried about hive beetle, so that they can consume it before the beetle has a chance to exploit that medium. That seems like a good thing. But certainly, like you said, Kim, and Mike, you know, you're doing this for a living. It's a very, very different perspective. You want the bees to take care as much as they can, take care of themselves as much as they can, so that you don't have to spend the time and the resources doing it for them. Right. I've lost track of where I was. Everyone, again, I think the three of you mentioned ventilation and the importance of that. I think that we've got a couple of questions here, and I think we need to talk a little bit about sort of why that is so important. Why is ventilation so important when overwintering? And Harry, you said it best, I think, when you said that the cold doesn't kill bees. It's the moisture that kills bees. Why is getting rid of that moisture? First off, what's the source of that moisture, and why is it so important to get rid of it?
Well, bees are like humans. They metabolize their food, and the result is carbon dioxide and water in the form of vapor. And that vapor rises to the top in a warm environment in the hive, and if it hits a cold surface, it's going to condense and drip back down on the cluster, which is going to chill them, and that's the biggest problem. And in Mississippi, we don't have to worry about that too much. When you have a severe winter down in Mississippi where the bees may be confined 10 to 15 days, you know, in a cluster, which is very seldom. I've seen it only happen once in my 30-something years where the bees actually died with honey in the hive because they got chill from moisture dripping down inside on them. If that ventilation is there, you've got a hive entrance that's open, you don't have to worry about Mississippi normally.
All right. Yeah, I think a lot of times people assume it's from snow and ground moisture, that's where that moisture is coming from, and certainly that can add to the overall moisture content of the hive. But you said it exactly right, that it's just the bees just exhaling and letting that moisture out. We've got a couple questions here. It's somewhat related to overwintering, but we're deviating just a little bit. But again, you all mentioned queens. We've got a question saying that a person's had a terrible time with queens and nukes. We've got questions about requeening, how often, when, etc. And Mike, you're a queen breeder. What are your thoughts on the queens these days, and how often should someone requeen, and when do you think is the best time to do it?
I don't know what to think about queens these days. You know, I only know my own, so I hear all kinds of stories. No, seriously, I hear all kinds of stories about queens coming from faraway places that just don't make it up here in the north. And so, you know, I don't know what to say about that, and I don't know what the problem is if people in the beekeepers in the south are only trying to raise numbers and not quality. I don't know. I don't know what to say. As far as how often you should requeen, I don't requeen by the calendar. I requeen when I think a colony needs to be requeened. And my first round of requeening is in the springtime with overwintered nucleus colonies. So I can have queens that I raise ready for requeening, and I can requeen colonies in April and May. Where if I raised them that year, I'd have to wait until the middle of June. And I don't have to buy queens in from faraway places because I have all these nucleus colonies wintering. I think the best time to requeen is when they're having a problem. If you're relying on bought queens to requeen your bees, the best time to requeen is when the best queens are available, which I would think would be when the queens are being raised under ideal conditions like the main honey flow, rather than trying to get them early and having them raised. For instance, down south this spring was so cold that they had a hard time raising queens. You don't want queens raised under severe conditions like that. You want queens raised under the best conditions. And you want to requeen your colonies on a flow. The best time to do any bee work, any requeening work, is always on a flow. So that's the best time to requeen.
All right. Kim, I know you and I have talked about queens in the past. What are your thoughts on queens?
Well, Mike, I think summed up everything well, with one exception, and that is I don't have my own queens. I don't raise queens. Most people don't, so we're either at the mercy or we're at least we're at the mercy of everybody who does raise queens wherever we can get them. So to reduce some of those problems, like Mike, I'm requeening in the summer. I don't like anything early if I can avoid it. If I got a colony, I've got some nukes that I winter over, or I try to winter over, and those are my early. If I got an early queen problem, that's the way I'll go. But later in the season, I try to requeen everybody at least once a year, sometimes twice if you get a bad queen. 3 times, you know, isn't uncommon. But I try to have a fresh queen, you know, in every colony every year. And exactly like you said, and when I'm talking to a queen producer, I ask the right questions. And how long has she been, you know, how long was she in the mating nuke? Have you seen the brood? All of these things. And try to make sure that I'm getting the best queen, the queen producers raising at the best time of the year for them. And it's like Mike said, it's, you know, when's the weather the best, and things slow down for queen producers a little bit in the summer, so they got a little more time. One would hope anyway, and it's not perfect, and I wish it was better, and I need to start raising my own queens.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions for Mike up in the north regarding wrapping. First off, when do you wrap your hives? Do you have them wrapped up now?
Nope, I'm just starting feeding. We're just weighing all of the hives right now, getting ready to start making syrup and feeding, and we'll be done feeding by, before the middle of October. We start right now, and we carry through till about the middle of October. Everything is fed by then so that it can be ripened. And at that point, we can start wrapping. So we start wrapping probably the 3rd week of October and finish it up by the middle of November, depending on the weather, how much snow we get, how much rain we get.
We've got someone from Alaska that says they've got weeks of 40 below zero temperatures, and they're just looking for any sort of tips you might be able to give them. Mike, is there anything? I mean, you get some pretty extreme temperature up there for extended periods of time. I mean, is there, other than what you've gone over, is there any other tips that maybe you can share that could benefit those folks that are in similar situations?
You know, I think once you get into the prairies of Alberta up north, and when it's 35 below zero for long periods of time, I think they have to pack their bees. Packing and wrapping are different. Wrapping is just a black paper around the hive to absorb the heat of the sun. Packing is actually putting insulation around the hive and maybe the black wrapper on the outside of that. And I would go online first, and I would look to see how to properly pack a hive. Or maybe you should talk to some folks in Alaska and see how they pack their hives. I know there's a guy in Anchorage that uses pink styrofoam or Reflectix styrofoam and makes a shell around the hive. So, I mean, I'm really unfamiliar with that, although I know that that's what they do.
Shane, if you can find that last slide of mine.
I was going there. I think that as soon as he mentioned packing, sort of, go ahead, Kim.
Well, where you've got your pointer right now down the bottom right is that four-way where they put 4 colonies together and insulate and wrap, and you can see everything's tied down. They've got plywood on the top. Each colony has an entrance going out, and you'll find mid to late winter, all of the bees and all of the colonies are right in the center. They've all gone to that corner because that's the warmest corner. And with enough insulation and windbreaks, they'll do okay. You go one up above that, and there's classic packing, whole rows of colonies, well insulated. Entrances on the bottom, some ventilation in there, but not a lot. But they don't need a terrible amount because the air doesn't get, the tops don't get all that cold. Like Mike's styrofoam, when warm air rises, because his tops of his hives have that styrofoam on, the tops aren't cold, so you don't get that condensation, or as much as that condensation isn't a problem. You go up even further and you get indoor wintering, and I think if I was living in Alaska and had the conditions your caller had in, this might be something I'd seriously think about. And of course it's not cheap, but then, you know, shipping a 3-pound package to Alaska probably isn't all that inexpensive either. You could go over to the top left, and they used to do indoor cellar wintering years ago, and their ventilation is a problem because you got to get CO2 out of there. But the guys that are doing it in Canada, there's an excellent book out on wintering bees in Canada, put out by, I forget the people, I forget the province, but I'm sure you can find it if you Google it. But it tells about indoor wintering, and I'm thinking that if I had that kind of weather, I wouldn't be living in Alaska to begin with. But that's another story.
That's why you moved out of Wisconsin?
Absolutely.
We're getting some questions about medications for Varroa. There's a question specifically about the Mighty Way Quick Strip, which we don't quite have available yet. We've got some questions about fumagillin, and Kim, I'm going to start with you because you and I today have been sort of going back and forth a little bit on fumagillin. But now we're sort of branching out a little bit beyond overwintering because, like we mentioned, a lot of this stuff should have been done a little bit earlier, depending on where you are. But it gets a little dicey. But I guess let me phrase the question this way: what do you use in your colonies to make sure they're healthy?
Whoa. Well, the mite control that I have, the bees that I use are primarily Russian or Russian derived, so tracheal mites seem not to be an issue. Drone trapping seems to keep varroa mites under check. The bugaboo foul brood comes and goes, and if it comes, you burn, and hopefully hygienic behavior keeps it under control. But The bugaboo right now is, you hit it on the head, is nosema, the new nosema, and there's no good symptoms to point at and say, yeah, I got it, no, I don't, yeah, I got it bad, I've only got it a little. If people want to know, my first piece of advice is to have them tested and send them, take a sample and send it to Beltsville, get a spore count. Well, what's a spore count mean? Well, it depends on the time of year, and I'm not seeing good answers from anybody right now on what's a bad spore count at what time of year, because if you got 1 million spore count with the old nosema, that was terrible. Now it's not. If you got 7 million spores per bee in July, is that bad? Probably, but I can't give you more than that. So what do I use for nosema? The first thing I try to do for nosema is make sure that it doesn't show up. If nutrition, I think, is probably the biggest key, and all the other stresses keep reduced. It's certainly going to help, but if it shows up, or if I think it shows up because there's not good symptoms, I am taking samples and getting them counted, and I think that's probably your best key, is if you're taking spring, early summer, late summer, fall samples and watching the trends in counts. And if they're going up, that's going to tell you that you need to take some kind of action. What kind of action? Probably nutritional. Get some of the feeding stimulants in there, get good food in there, get lots of good food in there. The last call, of course, is going to be the antibiotic fumagillin, and does that help? And there's a lot of people that are saying, well, not as much as getting the feeding stimulants in there and getting just lots of good food into them. I don't have a good answer for that, Shane. If you're just anti-chemical, then you're going to be doing this the feeding thing. If bees are putting food on your table, and you're worried about losing 20, 30, 40, 50% to this and a virus combination, then you got some head scratching to do, and you're going to be looking at probably doing something else, and the something else is probably fumagillin.
Mike, and then we'll go to Harry. Mike, do you worry about nosema? Do you feed fumagillin? And if you don't, do you feed something else, or is that just not something you think about?
Yeah, sure. I worry about nosema, but I don't feed fumagillin. New York State tested my bees the last couple of years, not this year, but they started off with some low mite counts, sometimes 1.5 million spores, and lots of yards were not detectable. And last summer I had plenty of yards that were not detectable, but some of the yards were up into the 5 and 7 million range. And, I didn't feed them fumagillin, and they came through the winter okay. And all the stories I hear about fumagillin being so hard on the bees, I wonder if my high spore counts here aren't a problem, because we have such good nutrition. We have such great pollens here that I wonder if the bees can recover from that, or if it doesn't really affect them too bad, because I really haven't seen losses from nosema disease.
Actually, I want to stay with you just for a little bit, Mike. You mentioned that what you've heard about fumagillin. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Has there been any studies or something that you've come across that sort of indicate fumagillin might be a little harsh on the bees, or is this just anecdotal evidence that you've encountered from other beekeepers?
Just reading the posts on BL, for instance, and they talk about.
And I just want to interject here that BL is it's a forum. It's a news group online that is subscriber based.
Yeah, and it's got a lot of the scientists and larger beekeepers in the world, all around the world, in it. And it seems like high spore counts are more of a problem in places like Spain, and hot, dry places that maybe don't have the great nutrition that we have in the Champlain Valley. And so I'm wondering if maybe that's the problem, and that if it acts differently, if nosema acts differently in different climates. And so I can only tell you from what I've read there of people what they're talking about, and about how hard that fumagillin is on the bees. So I think I'm going to go. I'm going to wait and see. And if I start losing bees to nosema disease, I mean a large percent, I don't mind losing 10% of my bees to whatever. That's okay because that gets rid of the garbage. But so that's why I'm waiting. I'm going to wait and see.
All right, and Harry, what about down your way? What are your thoughts on nosema? My first impression would be that it probably, at least nosema apis, wouldn't be as much of an issue because they get those cleansing flights more frequently than, say, Mike would get.
That's correct. Up until, well, really, we've never have recommended feeding fumagillin down here. I personally think nosema is a stress disease. And kind of like Mike, nutrition is probably going to play a big role in it, and proper management, good young queens to keep, those bees hatching and keep the hive strong, and they can deal with it, I think, in most cases. Now, the new nosema, I think we're going to have to wait and see. It could be a problem, but, I don't know, and I don't think anybody else knows yet. But I think it's going to be key to stress.
All right. Mike, we're going to go back to you. We've got questions about your overwintering nukes again. People are curious about, in those nukes, how many frames you've got, what sort of ratio of brood to frames of honey. Do you insulate on top of those nukes the way you do your other colonies? Can you... Like I said, I knew that was going to open up a lot of questions about that. Can you give us just a sort of a insight into that?
Yes, I do insulate the nukes the same as I do the production colonies with a piece of styrofoam on top of the inner cover on my nukes is a grain bag or a seed bag, one of those plastic seed bags, and actually the nuke box becomes the insulation for the production hive, so there isn't a piece of styrofoam on the production hive with a nuke on top of it. The foam goes up on top of the nuke. What was the other question?
Just the ratio of brood to
to
so honey.
What I do in the summer when I start my nucleus colonies, I'm breaking up colonies that are not productive. So, those colonies that are struggling through the summer and not only producing a super or two when others are doing well, those are the ones you struggle with to get through the winter. You requeen them and all that. Well, you know what? I just break them up. I break them up into nukes, and I say the heck with it. And I just sacrifice those colonies to make my nucleus colonies. And the nucleus colonies, I start them about between the end of June and the end of July, first week of August, with a frame and a little bit of brood and a frame of honey and an empty comb. And then I give them a queen. And they start to expand, and pretty soon they have 2 and 3 and sometimes 4 frames of brood, and then a good flow happens and they swarm. So you have to do something about it. You can either remove frames of brood and bees and make more nukes, or you can add a second super. You can add another nuke box on top of them, which I think in hot areas is even probably a better idea, because they tend to even abscond when it's really hot. They'll just fly away with the queen, leaving no queen cells behind. So, at that point, if you can put a second story on top of them, they'll sometimes have 6 or 7 frames of brood and make a giant cluster of bees. And about the middle of August, the beginning of my goldenrod flow, or the end of the loose strife and the beginning of the goldenrod flow, I really have to manage them so that they don't get too crowded. But by letting them draw foundation out and removing frames of honey or brood and putting in empty comb at the right time, you can pretty much get them to the point where they give up the swarming and they just pack the top of the box with the top super with honey. So today I was looking at nukes today. I looked at around 130 nukes, and the one-story nukes, they probably needed anywhere between 1 gallon if they had some honey and 2 gallons of 2-to-1 syrup if they had no honey. And the 2-story nukes, I have to feed very few of them. Most of them are just packed solid with bees and goldenrod honey.
All right. I once again lost track here a little bit. We've got some questions. There have been some questions about hive beetle and how best to deal with those. Again, we're not necessarily dealing specifically about overwintering, but Harry, what's your advice on dealing with hive beetle? Because you're the one that's probably in the thick of it more so than anyone else here.
Well, first of all, there's no perfect thing that's going to deal with them like you'd like to have. It's basically a management thing. The treatments that are out there that are approved for it are really not that great. Management involves keeping the hives in full sun. From my experience, you have very little problem when the bees are kept in full sun. If you put them in a deep shade, they're going to have serious problems. Keep the hive strong with good queens and treat it properly with mites. Re-queen them as soon as you can. Seems like when a hive goes queenless, it's just a magnet for beetles to move in. You don't have long to take care of business there either, because they can literally destroy a hive in just a week or so. So management is the key. That's how to best deal with it as far as I know. Treatments with the camouflage strips, not that great really. Some of the traps are okay, but they're not going to eliminate the problem, and if managed properly, they're labor intensive. If managed properly, they can keep beetles under control, but it's a lot of labor to it, and then commercial guys just don't have that time to deal with it.
Do you have a particular trap that you like? I mean, it seems that, there's really only two things that sort of kill hive beetles, so to speak, and that's Guard Star, which is a soil application, and then, of course, Checkmate, which is inside the hive. The problem with Guard Star is that it gets the larvae after they leave the hive, and so they've already done their damage. So really one of the best ways to deal with them are sort of trapping them with traps. Do you have a preferred trap that's out there that you like the best?
I really don't have much experience with traps myself. I haven't used them. Other management practice have really handled my problem pretty good. There are several good traps out there. Some are more labor intensive than others. The Freeman trap, I think, is one of the better ones that's come out, and the Hood trap. I hate to start recommending traps, but so be my first option. Some are kind of what you can afford. Some of them are pretty expensive. And
so perhaps maybe I'll help take you off the spot a little bit since I put you on there with making a recommendation. Maybe start, if you think you've got a problem, start with an inexpensive one, and then sort of because generally those have a smaller capacity, and then maybe graduate up to something a little bit more significant once you realize that you've got a real bad infestation.
Right. Now the Guard Star, I will make a comment here. Guard Star will kill what's in your apiary, but unless everybody in your neighborhood for miles is treating, you're wasting your time to a large degree.
Okay. Harry, let's stay with you a little bit. You mentioned skunks as an issue. We've got a question about how high to keep colonies off the ground, and I've always heard that elevating colonies will help a bit with the skunk problem. Do you find that to be true if you elevate a hive off the ground?
Yeah, skunks cannot climb or will not climb. So if you get a hive up off the ground enough that they can't reach it with their 4 feet, you're probably okay.
Okay. And Kim, I'll go back to you. We have a question about Honeybee Healthy, and you mentioned a little bit on supplements and such. I guess we're looking for recommendations, but how much do you think that those there's a whole suite now? It seems like the market's been flooded the past year or two with these feeding supplements, stimulants, etc. How much do you think those are fluff, and how much do you think really have some benefit?
I know that their role as a feeding stimulant in that sugar syrup doesn't have an odor, and there's not a dance for the bees in the bottom of the hive to say, you know, lunch is about 4 inches straight up. So for bees to find sugar syrup, they got to find it, and then they have to learn where it is, as opposed to somebody going out, finding it, coming back, and telling everybody how to get there. You go out this far and turn left, and you know, there it is. So if nothing else, these things are getting bees into sugar syrup, I think, faster, and continuing to get them up there. And you can see that my small controlled experiments, colonies with it, colonies without it, colonies with it, start eating fast, start eating sooner, and eat faster. So if nothing else, there's a value right there, is getting food into bees that are hungry or bees that need food. So that's part of it. The value of the essential oils in there, lemongrass and the rest of those, there's enough anecdotal evidence and enough real evidence that says these things have some antiviral and antimicrobial effects that can't be hurting and certainly are probably beneficial. So if they're helping a little bit with the nosema or with any of the things that are going on, if they're nursing the microbes that are in bees' guts to begin with and helping those out, and they're helping to get food into a bee sooner and more of it, I think that's a plus, don't you?
I would say yes. We've hit the 8 o'clock hour. We started pretty promptly at 6 o'clock. I know that all of us are exceptionally busy. I'd like to just do one quick round the table. What is, and just close with this, if you could each one of you suggest one single thing. What one single thing do you think is most important for successful overwintering for your particular geographic region? What tip, if you could give one tip to a beekeeper, what would that be to help them get through winter? And we'll start with you up there in Vermont, Mike.
One tip, huh? Okay. Well, I would make sure I had large clusters and enough honey. I know that's two, but
we'll let you slide.
Okay.
Harry?
Well, I have to say the same thing. I get more, after talking to beginner beekeepers, the biggest problem that I hear that when they lose their bees is they let them starve during the winter. They don't have enough food stores going out and carrying them through in the spring.
And Kim?
And I think that's right. Large clusters or small clusters, I favor both depending on the bees. But you got to have enough food, and you got to have enough food to last until figure May, because you may not get out there until May. So it's enough food for enough time, and I think you'll be more successful than that.
So there you have it. If you have a large cluster and ample amount of honey, your colony is going to overwinter. You heard it from these three right here. If you are able to get that magic combination, you'll be successful. I'd like to take this last few minutes to just say thank you to the three of you for spending these 2 hours with us. I really do appreciate it. We had a lot of good questions that we unfortunately did not get to. I'll try and follow up on some of those here in the next day or so. I'll be out of town the rest of this week, but on the road checking email, so I'll try and follow up with those. Mike Palmer up in the very northern reaches of Vermont, thank you very much. He, again, for those of you that are up in that area, does do queen breeding and sells newts. If you're in that area, look him up. I'm sure he'll do his best to help you out. We've got Harry Fulton down in Mississippi, retired state apiarist that has a good deal of experience under his belt in the southern climates. Harry, thank you very much for taking some time. I know that your schedule as of late has been very fluid, and we're not really sure where you were going to be when, but you managed to fit us in, and I really do appreciate that. And of course, Kim Flottum in Ohio, editor of Bee Culture Magazine. I'd like to thank each and every one listening in, and our three panelists. Thank you very much, and good luck this winter, and hopefully we'll see you back here for our next webinar. I'm not quite sure what it will be, but thank you everyone, and thank you to our three panelists. Have a good evening.